All right, thanks everyone. A huge thanks to all of you for joining us today. My name is Debbie Landis. I work with CARE US and I'm the co-lead of the Localization Task team of the GBV AOR. And this webinar is sponsored by the GBV AOR as part of the work that we have been doing over the past year and a half or so. I wanted to give a quick background of what the GBV AOR is for those of you who may not be familiar. The GBV AOR is a group that was, as you know, is sort of the global coordination group for gender-based violence, and as part of that, the task team on localization was formed as a result of wanting to build on the momentum for localization within the context of humanitarian settings that's happening through things like the grand bargain and just across the board within the humanitarian sector generally. And there's also recognition that within the context of gender-based violence programming and coordination systems, there's a need for looking at the unique aspects of localization and why in particular there's a lot of similarities with localization that's happening in other sectors, but there's a lot of specific things about the way localization can be carried out in order for it to be effective that are really important. But we also knew that there were a lot of challenges, and there's a lot that we don't necessarily know about localization within the context of gender-based violence, prevention, response, and coordination. So the task team was formed, and one of the activities that we did at the initial stage of our work was to do a mapping study looking at localization within the context of gender-based violence programming in humanitarian settings. So that is the focus of our webinar today. The final report is being putting the final touches on, so will be available soon. And we're very excited to have Carly Bennett give the presentation today. And I would say just a quick note, if all of you could mute your microphones if you're not speaking, and then we'll have a time for questions at the end. Thank you so much. So I wanted to give a quick introduction to Carly. Carly Bennett is the consultant and the lead researcher for this piece of work. Excuse me, and Carly is the one who conducted the interviews and did the analysis and wrote the report, so we're really thrilled to have her with us today. And what we're going to use this time for is Carly is going to walk through the key findings and recommendations that she found based on the study, and then we will have a time for questions and answers and discussion at the end. So I would say we can have Carly do the presentation and then save time for questions at the end. But if there's any real burning issues along the way, feel free, but I think we wanna allow as much time as possible for the presentation first, and then we can definitely have a time of discussion at the end. And then we can, happy to talk about any of these issues because I think there's a lot of interest in this and a lot of really exciting aspects to discuss. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Carly.
Hi, Debbie. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Apologies, I'm also getting over a little bit of a cold if you hear me coughing. And Debbie, if you could advance the slides for me, that would be really appreciated. Thank you again. So as Debbie discussed, we're going to jump in today and review basically the findings of the study. So I know right now we only have 22 participants, so I'm not going to try not to go too long, so we have kind of extra time to discuss the findings and some greater thoughts. But we're going to first go over the goal and the methodology of the study. We'll go over the findings of the study, which are kind of bracketed into three topics: the quantitative findings, the qualitative findings, and then within qualitative, what we are calling good and bad practices within functional areas. Then we'll look at recommendations and then move on to the questions and discussion. I would also like to note again, localization can be a topic that has, brings forward many strong opinions. And just to note that, of course, this study is not encompassing all views, not all actors, and it is only covering several contexts. So we can discuss that further. Debbie, next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so what was the goal of the study? There's been a lot of localization research conducted thus far in the humanitarian space, but specifically the goal of the study was to guide the GBV AOR, and specifically the Localization Task team, on really ways forward to address localization within GBV response coordination. I think that's a critical note there, is it's not looking just at programming, but specifically at coordination and the GBV subcluster as a mechanism to improve localization. So as I mentioned in the last slide, looking at functional areas, priority themes are identified by actors, members of the GBV subcluster at the local and international level, as what were things that this study should be looking at. So the priority themes look specifically at participation of local organizations in the GBV subcluster, leadership roles and decision-making, participation of local organizations within the humanitarian needs overview, H&O, and response planning, HRP, access of local organizations to country-based pooled funding, access to quality and equal partnerships, and lastly, the engagement of women-led organizations or female activists at the national subcluster level. I'll also make a note here, throughout the study, I'm using the term local organizations rather than say CBO, CSO, or an NGO, because we're looking at multiple contexts. So it was, of course, there's not really one agreed upon definition across contexts. So when we're saying local organizations, we're saying that as a catch-all for many different types of local organizations based on how they define themselves. And Debbie, can you advance? It should pop up. I don't know why it, sorry, yeah, great. So methodology, first we reviewed the key localization research. Right now there's quite a bit. The Child Protection AOR did quite a bit last year as well. So we reviewed those key documents. Next we moved into quantitative data. So quantitative data, we were looking at analysis conducted by the GBV AOR, which was both H&O HRP analysis from 2017 and 2018. The GBV AOR also did their coordinator baseline survey. We used that data and then data specifically from our 4 priority contexts. And then qualitative data, we collected 45 key informant interviews, and these were done through snowball sampling. Basically, we identified the 4 priority contexts. From there, we contacted the GBV subcluster lead and then asked them to provide for us names of people and so forth. All right, so you'll see at the top our 4 priority areas were identified as Iraq, Nigeria, South Sudan, and the whole of Syria, Turkey hub. Overall, the shows, again, 45 key informants were seen. About half, so 49% of the key informants were representing local organizations, a CSO or a national NGO. 89% of those interviewed were female, and nearly 30% represented women-led organizations. And I see a note right now from Nabila. No, we did not have Afghanistan. Unfortunately, we didn't, we're not able to cover every context. We selected these 4 contexts mainly because we had to choose areas that did have a large subcluster that was functioning to be able to really look at the role. So these 4 contexts were identified by the GBV AOR. So yeah, Afghanistan was unfortunately not a context. So moving into the key findings, the quantitative findings. This is a lot of data. So of course, these slides are a bit heavy. We'll share them with everyone afterwards. And of course, we'll shortly be releasing the summary report and the long form report. But this gives, looking at the GBV AOR baseline study overall, kind of gives you the general picture for subclusters. So on average, subclusters have around 42 member organizations at the national level. That's quite large. They're about 51% local. Again, this is not talking about meaningful representation. This is talking about strictly membership. So CSO and national NGOs represent about 50% on average for national subclusters. But it is a little bit uneven. So for example, 17% of clusters have no national NGO members and 58% have no CSO members. This could also be partially due to, again, as I discussed early on, some issues around terminology. Many organizations might not define themselves as a CBO or CSO, rather an NGO. But overall showing that although 51% local overall, there are still a substantive number of clusters that do not have local membership, local organizations that are members. Some other really important points that came out of the survey, which will be more important as we go through the findings, is that only 16% or 4 coordinators were on long-term contracts. 9 or 35% of national subclusters are co-led by an INGO, whereas only 1 subcluster is led by a local actor, a national NGO, and this is the subcluster in Yemen, which is co-led by the Yemen Women Union. And so this is, again, looking at the GBV AOR baseline survey, but specifically for our 4 contexts, just to show that our 4 contexts really fit into what we saw in the last slide, what is common for all global subclusters. So you see that for Iraq, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Turkey, they all have a large number of members, between 50 and 86. They're nearly half, Iraq, Nigeria, and South Sudan, around half local actors, that's national NGOs, whereas the whole of Syria Turkey hub is predominantly local actors, 91%. 3 of the 4 are highly decentralized, right? This is meaning that there are sub-national coordination groups. Iraq has 8, Nigeria 3, and South Sudan has 14. So again, keep this in mind, the ability to decentralize when we go further through the findings. Whereas the whole of Syria Turkey hub only has the 1 coordination group. They do not have sub-national coordination groups. Sorry, can you go back really quick, Debbie? So a few other points. Not all subclusters have SAGs, which are strategic advisory groups, but Iraq, Nigeria, and South Sudan did. And of those, there were members that were local actors, national NGOs that were on the SAG. And also looking at approval for HRP projects and funding, we see that in all contexts, somewhat high approval rate for HRP for local projects. That's the second to last column. In the last column, we're looking at the overall percentage that local actors are receiving of the pooled funding. And this is a bit low in Iraq and Nigeria, 22%, South Sudan, 43%, and whole of Syria, Turkey, 84%. So that's showing that pretty much, you know, the bulk of the pooled funding is going to local actors. So go ahead, next slide, thank you. All right, so I won't beleaguer this point too much, but we also looked at the inclusion of both GBV and localization in HNOs and HRPs. This has been something that the GBV AOR has been doing for for the past few years, again, you know, as an advocacy tool to increase the inclusion of GBV, meaningful inclusion of GBV in the HNO and HRPs. And really, we saw that localization overall is poorly represented in HNOs and HRPs. So of course, localization within GBV is also poorly represented. But overall, we can see that there has not been much improvement in the inclusion of GBV and HNOs between 2016 and 2018, but there has been a market improvement in HRPs. We specifically see that in the dedicated operation plan for GBV, either a standalone or within the protection section. Only 11% of HRPs had this in 2016, whereas in 2018, nearly half did. And some good practices, both Nigeria and Cameroon had standalone GBV operation plans. All right, so moving into the qualitative findings. So we saw through the key informant interviews that overall localization is still highly context dependent and driven by individuals, which means ad hoc. So because there is kind of a lack of a framework or lack of certain requirements set at global or national levels. It is still very much driven by individuals. So you hear a lot, this depends specifically on humanitarian leadership within the country and the context itself. Overall, as well, localization is intertwined with the perception of the entire humanitarian system and program quality. So really separating out localization as seen through the subcluster itself is quite impossible. Overall, actors still see, and this is across all actors, not local actors, this is local, international, and global actors, perceive the level of localization as being very low. Local actors overall feel that the intent is very inauthentic and the system is unfair. So we hear a lot in interviews saying that localization is a checkbox or localization is donor-driven, meaning that local actors do not feel meaningfully included, but rather they feel, okay, donors are pushing for localization, donors are saying you need to have a local actor, so they're being included, but not on an equal footing. Purity of intent came up quite a bit as a concern for all parties. So this is also a major concern for subclusters when funding for GBV is available and that new entrants, national NGOs, are coming into the subcluster looking for funding. So these are organizations that have not had a track record working in GBV or women's rights, but rather, as one informant putting it, you know, they're following the money or it's business thinking. And so this is a concern from all parties across the board. So we also see in contexts where there is high localization, there is still systematic barriers for local actors. We see the two main roads to push localization being equal partnerships and access to pooled funding. For local actors, pooled funding is really going to be the main source of financial support, and partnerships also another road to accessing financial support and capacity building. But overall, local actors perceived partnerships to be exploitative and pooled funding to be still either unreachable or unfair in the way that it's allocated. And lastly, another point that we looked at for this research was the inclusion of women-led organizations, knowing that really localization within the subcluster has to really include women leadership and women-led organizations. But unfortunately, there were no good practices identified in the research. And in the four contexts, local actors and international actors talked about women-led organizations being either excluded or that inclusion being driven only by the context. Again, this means women-led organizations are included either because it is cheaper to use a local organization, they have access, and therefore international organizations are using WLOs specifically just because they have that access, not because they recognize the inherent value in using them themselves. Another key finding that came out of this research was overall the challenge around defining localization and what localization means. Everyone identified that really kind of a mind shift for equal access is required, and that building trust and sustainability is really critical. And I think this came out really loud and clear that local actors are not saying localization means 100% local, but rather, again, it means having a fair share, equal partnership, and equal footing. Power dynamics also came out a lot in the research. So talking about really the way that power is played out both within the subcluster itself and in the humanitarian system. So talking about hierarchies within the subcluster, within the cluster system and within the humanitarian system, competition between local actors, international actors, and the government. And lastly, this concept, which we'll be further discussing, of the blessed few. This has come out in other localization research, but the blessed few is basically the concept that localization, when it is occurring, is only occurring for a handful of local organizations that usually tend to be, for this research, an implementing partner for UNFPA or other large GBV funders. And that really only these few organizations are receiving funding and attention, and it's not local organizations as a whole. Another finding is that really the role of the GBV subcluster is incredibly complex. There's a lot of balancing that goes on here, that on the one hand, coordinators have to manage expectations that many people can come, new entrants can come to the subcluster looking for funding when it isn't always there. So that managing expectations around access to funding, but then also balancing both inclusion and quality. Many actors talked about the frustration that what can happen when subclusters tend to have 40, 50, 60 members is that what's the quality of membership? And yet you want to have an open door policy and you want to have people be able to join your subcluster, but then that, what happens there, right? The issue of, is quality driven down? Should there be, you know, stringent standards in place as to who can join the subcluster? And then lastly, subcluster coordinators having to balance both coordination and programming. Sorry, Debbie, can you go back? Thank you so much. Sorry, I was about to cough. Thank you. So for capacity building, what came out really loud and clear was a failure of current models. So being these, you know, kind of several day one-off trainings, all actors talked about as being actually quite either insulting or not useful. And all actors really talked about needing to look beyond these one-off trainings towards more meaningful capacity building. So this is looking at coaching, secondment, mentorship, rather than these one-off trainings. I think it was really great. One key informant said, you know, we train for us, not for them. Right? Meaning that training can be a checkbox for the funder or for the larger organization rather than training for what a local organization actually needs. I think it's also important to talk about what came through this research, both added benefits and unintended consequences with localization. So in terms of added benefits, local actors talked about how actually advocating for their inclusion in the subcluster and in the system actually improved the strength and the positioning, not only of their organizations, but also was good lessons learned for their staff. So organizations seeing that they have to really advocate, local organizations advocate for themselves to be included. Actors also talked about GBV mainstreaming, saying that local actors, of course, if they're participating in other subclusters and as members of local communities, they're really pushing forward the agenda for GBV. And lastly, civil society building. So strengthening local actors, improving the quality of civil society at the national level. And I think some other important unintended consequences that came out, one being competition, that what can happen is competition created between local actors and the government for funding. And this can also lead to erosion of national NGOs and movement building. We can talk about this a little more. This was seen in certain contexts too, where local actors lost space when large INGOs moved into the emergency and then took up the funding and then reduced the space and the funding for national NGOs, which was seen as, you know, really eroding movements and eroding civil society. And again, this is also seen for women-led organizations who say that they're seeing a diminished space, that they're losing this when larger actors are coming in, and that unfortunately when GBV funding, instead of going to small actors or women-led organizations, when that funding goes to large male-led NGOs at the national level, stereotypes are being reinforced, as one informant said, basically saying that women cannot speak, we cannot speak for ourselves, we need men to speak for us. So I think one of the main takeaways from the qualitative data is that all actors know what needs to change. There was a really high agreement across all actors, yet everyone sees that accountability and kind of the operationalization is what is lacking. Okay, so apologies, this graph can be a little bit confusing. So let me explain. So basically we have our 4 contexts, Iraq, Nigeria, South Sudan, and the whole of Syria, Turkey hub mapped out here. And basically what we have on our 2 axes is a perceived level of localization and a perceived level of intent. So as I had said earlier in the presentation, because localization is still very much ad hoc and context driven, the idea of intent is extremely important in terms of how local actors perceive actions towards localization. So we see in the left corner, the whole of Syria-Turkey hub has high localization with a low perceived level of intent. So this is because of the context. As we said earlier, virtually the entire subcluster is made up of local actors, and that's because of context restrictions. International actors have not been allowed in. So because of this, even though the whole of Syria-Turkey hub is talked about as a gold standard in localization, which they for sure are, they have done fantastic, amazing things, it's a little bit difficult because that is not really a roadmap for other contexts, because artificially this context does not have international actors. Whereas you can see for Iraq, Nigeria, and South Sudan, which are contexts which have many international actors, their level of perceived localization is directly linked to the perceived level of intent. So this means intent on the humanitarian system overall and of the subcluster to include local actors. All right, so this is a way of kind of breaking down that last graph. So we'll see, for example, we talked about these functional areas. So the first functional area being participation. So Iraq and Nigeria, local actors discussed that participation was not very meaningful in the subcluster for local actors, whereas South Sudan and the whole of Syria-Turkey hub, inclusion of local actors was meaningful. Decision-making was seen as equal for South Sudan and the whole of Syria hub, whereas for Iraq and Nigeria, decision-making was seen only for the blessed few. Again, blessed few means there are only a handful of small local organizations which have access to decision-making and power, either because they are an IP or they had, very strong capacity and strong operational presence before the emergency. And then for all contexts, there was no kind of best practices shown for women-led organizations having access to the subcluster. All right, so when we went through and I coded all of our qualitative data, basically what came out of this is what you're seeing now. So the coding frame is that under the general study, we were looking at the drivers and the barriers to localization. So when we were talking to key informants, we're looking at really what are the gaps, what are the challenges, and what's pushing localization within your context. And out of the coding, there came 4 themes and 8 sub-themes. So the 4 themes are patriarchy, the humanitarian system, roles and dynamics, and the country context. And within each of those sub-themes, under patriarchy, we have patriarchy within the humanitarian system and patriarchy emerging from the country level. Within the theme of the humanitarian system, we have the sub-themes of hierarchies or power, and also the sub-theme of the architecture of the humanitarian system or the inflexibility of the humanitarian system. The third theme, roles and dynamics, we looked at, there are 2 sub-themes that emerged, one being what were really the responsibilities and roles within the subcluster, and then secondly, interpersonal dynamics between and within members. And then lastly, we have the sub-theme under the country context of the general operating environment, and then the systems within that country. So if you can see, basically, the humanitarian system and patriarchy were seen to be barriers. By all actors, they were seen to be barriers to localization. Whereas the country context and responsibilities and dynamics within the subcluster were seen to be a mixed driver and barrier. So for example, the country context in the whole of Syria-Turkey hub is seen to be a driver, driving localization. Whereas in other contexts, for example, in Nigeria, some actors saw the country context as being a barrier to localization. Similarly, the responsibilities and dynamics played out very differently in each context, so the subcluster itself can be seen as a driver or a barrier to localization. All right, so again, we're going to share these slides. I don't want to, dive too deeply into this, but we're going to explore what I just put up, these 4 the 4 overarching themes. programs. So again, the humanitarian system is really seen as marked by hierarchy and inequality. The humanitarian system is seen as being very risk averse, and that many local actors are really accused of being unable to provide either quality services, they don't have capacity, or that they cannot align with humanitarian principles. And actors see this as really as an excuse or a roadblock to localization. Overall, the discussion around localization remains very top-down, and because of a lack of definition or operationalization, this leads to the ad hoc nature of localization we see at the national level. Really, local actors talked a lot about how they see the unfair treatment of local actors being played out through practices such as unequal pay, exploitative partnerships or IP agreements, unequal access to funding, and really humanitarian system, be it the HCT or the cluster system, not taking meaningful steps towards localization. Another important finding was that many local actors felt that really overall the GBV community's focus on life-saving work and an inability or an uninterest to address gender root causes is also driving service access at the longer term cost of replicating gender hierarchies. So I'll briefly read through some quotes from key informants that are really demonstrating a lot of the richness of the data we were just talking about in the last slide. So again, capacity. They stress we don't have capacity, but now there is money. They say we have capacity to compete at the same level. This is unfair. The sad part is they have access funding and then implement through local partners. Yet they think the local actor is not good enough to be a partner. They're an IP and nothing more. So again, this quote is reflecting what we've talked about earlier. Is there a reflection by local actors that local organizations are seen only as IPs, they're not seen as equal partners, and they're not given equal footing in program design and implementation. Another quote coming from an actor said, the humanitarian system's lack of willingness to address structural inequalities is the issue. The bigger question is how to convince the humanitarian industry to be transformative. I think this is another great quote that was brought forward by a local actor. They said, the main challenge is survival instincts. Even if INGOs want to partner, they need to survive. So they tend to transfer all risk to national partners. I think, again, this comes back to intent, that there's an understanding that many ways that the humanitarian system is structured is itself a barrier to localization, and that it's not so much actors not believing in the value of localization, but that's really how the system is set up. All right, so the next was looking at, this is a mixed driver and a barrier, the roles, responsibilities, and dynamics within the subcluster. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. So the role of subcluster coordinators is quite complex. They perceive their role as being a gatekeeper, ensuring both that they're quality services and that those quality services are in line with best practices. But then they also have to balance being inclusive and ensuring local organizations feel welcome within the subcluster. Local actors saw their roles differently. They perceived that they had a responsibility to communities and providing services, but more importantly, sustainability. Right? They're much more looking forward to what happens when the emergency is over and what happens when the aid caravan moves out and my organization is still here providing services to survivors. Local actors therefore really see coordination as inextricably linked with capacity building and long-term service provision. And it was mixed. Local actors really talked about interpersonal dynamics in the subcluster as both supportive, but sometimes as unfair and unequal. There was a lot of discussion of the replication of the hierarchy within the humanitarian system being replayed again within the subcluster. I think, again, the main takeaway from this is that the subcluster, there is a major driver for subclusters to be a driver for localization, yet meaningful inclusion and communication must be improved. And I think critically, all actors talked about this is that subcluster coordinators are already overwhelmed. Many times they're double or triple hatting. And so really the role of this research is not to say subcluster coordinators need to be doing more. Really, a key finding also is that subcluster coordinators must be on stable long-term contracts to be able to realize localization, right? If you're on a short-term contract, you're overwhelmed, there are gaps in subcluster coordination, really this cannot be realized. So again, balancing the fact that this cannot be on the subcluster coordinator alone. All right, so here are some quotes. We talked about this a bit earlier, talking about the challenge of new entrants coming into the subcluster, and new entrants that perhaps did not have what was called in the research as pure intent, organizations that did not previously work on gender or GBV. So this quote says, "Implementation can be part of business thinking, not passion. Local organizations are supposed to support services, but they're the very people who report survivors as ISIS affiliates." Another quote, "They don't involve us in decision making. For example, the last GBV sector working group, they did not include us," meaning local actors. "They think they know everything. We know our people and customs and traditions, and we are working in hard to reach areas." And the last quote here, "The real risk is sustainability of change. INGOs leave, and what impact have you made? The first principle is do no harm. Unintentionally, these INGOs cause harm. They bring services, then take them away. This is the hardest on GBV survivors. There's a responsibility of service providers to build structures and ensure change is sustainable. Thinking not as a savior, but when I leave, have we improved women's lives?" I won't read through all of these quotes. But again, so these quotes are talking about really the expectation of funding, that organizations get very frustrated when they come to the subcluster looking for funding and are unable to access it. There's another quote here talking about how supportive the subcluster has been as putting CSOs as number one, but really the challenge is the subcluster does sometimes have limited power and control within the humanitarian system overall. I think this is also a really important quote. It says here, "Decisions are based on who has what at the subcluster and the strategic advisory level. The one with the resources is recognized the most. Less money, less power. Strategic advisory group seats are opened at the national level does not mean our voice is heard, not same representation. Our commitment is not taken into consideration." So again, talking about the challenges around hierarchies and power dynamics played out again within the subcluster. All right, so moving on to another key 3 of the 4 themes. This is the country context. So this was discussed a little bit earlier when we talked about really the best practice of localization is seen within the context of the whole of Syria-Turkey hub. So in countries where access to the population is limited for INGOs and UN actors, local actors have greater power and access in the system. Yet this is not intentional, right? This is localization that is occurring due to the context, not because localization actually has buy-in from the humanitarian system. And you see, for example, in Iraq, when the context change and access is improved, local actors actually lose this space. The space is lost and then given to INGOs. And really local actors overall see their comparative advantage as access to the population and ability to face higher security risks and to perform tasks at lower costs. This, of course, causes the risk that local actors are taking on undue security risks rather than having equal footing with international.
Oh, hey, Carly. Oh, sorry, we cut out for a little bit, but I think you're back. Carly, hi, can everybody hear? I think the sound cut out for a second. Hey, Carly, I think that the sound may have cut out. Can you hear us okay? Apologies, everyone. Carly, are you able to hear us? Oh, hi everyone. So sorry. Carly just sent us a message. She got kicked out. She's going to try to call back in. Very sorry. Just bear with us for one moment. I think technology is not on our side today, but Carly is going to call right back in. Sorry about this, but yeah, she's going to call right back. Hi, everyone. So sorry about this. Carly is having some issues connecting, but we're going to try to get her back on the line. And we will also be making the presentation available to everyone as well, but she's in the process of trying to call back in.
Thanks, Debbie. No problem at all.
Apologies.
Hi, Carly. Welcome. No worries. Thanks, everyone, for bearing with us.
Thank
All right.
you.
Carly, welcome back. Thanks again.
I am in New York, but my internet connection is unstable. All right, so let me, I'm not sure where I cut off, but let me start again with the country context. Debbie, do you mind letting me know where I cut out? Should I begin again?
I think you were on the slide, the drivers and barriers with the country context. So maybe you could start, I think it cut out partway through the slide. So maybe you can, wherever you feel comfortable, feel free.
Yeah, so again, really the main takeaway here is that the country context, because localization has not been operationalized, the country context can be both a driver or a barrier overall. So really what can happen here is that when in spaces and contexts where access is limited for INGOs in the UN, local actors have greater power and access. Yet when these conditions change, local actors lose this space. So although the Turkey Hub really has some of the best practices in localization, this isn't really a roadmap on how to localize. This is really when the context is ripe for localization, what are the steps we can take? So really, again, localization is very ad hoc and highly dependent on the country context. So we even saw within country contexts themselves between, different humanitarian leadership that localization could be either, highly perceived or poorly perceived. So the last driver and barrier of patriarchy, which was seen to be, a pure barrier, overall, all actors talked about patriarchal societies and really the humanitarian system as being patriarchal, dominated by men, and that there are very limited spaces for women in response countries, as well as limited opportunities for female leadership and WLOs, both within local and international organizations. A lot of actors talked really about the limited space for the GBV subcluster in general, right? And that often GBV is the least funded or seen to be the least important within the response. This is also, a challenge for these local organizations. And overall, actors discuss that gender transformative work is not taking place within the greater humanitarian system or the GBV subcluster. And this is greatly concerning to all actors. And again, this concern that focus on life-saving work actually hampers localization in the long term, meaning moving away from addressing gender or root causes, that short-term service access is prioritized at the long-term cost of replicating these gender hierarchies, meaning what has happened In many contexts, local actors see that GBV funding is given to large male-led organizations. So that means that these male-led organizations take up the space, and that when the funding leaves or the emergency is ramped down, that local WLOs or local organizations that actually represented women's rights and provided GBV services have lost the funding in the space and have been perhaps decimated and are unable to function in a way they did before the emergency. So the greater concept here that came out very loud and clear through this research is that localization without gender transformative work is going to reinforce patriarchy and going to replicate systems of power and oppression, which can undermine GBV work in the long term. There were also some, concerning stories that came out about, for example, these male-led organizations which had instances of sexual harassment. For example, organizations that were virtually all men with only one GBV coordinator or only one program person that worked on GBV. And really the experience for that one woman in the organization and several organizations were talked about as being one in which sexual harassment was taking place, and where it was clear that organizations, local organizations that were male-led were not valuing GBV, but were rather following the money. All right, so here are some quotes really kind of highlighting these points that were brought under the theme of patriarchy. So this is from a local actor. The range of violence women are facing is increasing. If we continue this way, it's fake to say we are protecting women. Are we interested in protecting her rights? Are we interested in keeping our relationships going? Organizations would rather stay safe and not blame the government. Keep the patriarchal system and society going. Right now, men lead all positions. The INGO-UN system gives more space to male-led organizations because they are linked to the government. Strange that INGOs have the same way of thinking. This is corruption. This is about power. This repeats the stereotype. Men sit to represent women, which means that we need them to speak for us, that we cannot speak for ourselves. This is another quote from an international actor talking again about really the inclusion of women-led organizations. Saying here, working with women-driven organizations wasn't the focus. We never say, okay, let's do something to tackle gender stereotypes and root causes. This is not asked unless pushed. Clusters and INGOs need to push. We have a role to set the agenda for inclusion. Again, talking about how local actors are largely male-led. The quote here is, most organizations are managed by men. There are few strong WLOs. There is no space for them. This is a challenge because of patriarchal systems. Another quote, the reason why funding goes to male-led NGOs is because WLOs are not in the space. Barriers and criteria to lead projects is too high, so WLOs are often dropped. Then male NGOs get the contracts and they subgrant the same WLOs as their foot soldiers. And lastly, the vast majority of GBV subcluster members are women. Technical roles mainly women, yet the supervisors and the leads of the organizations are mainly men. The topic attracts women and is sensitive. Men in many NGOs, the bulk of their work is not in GBV and led by men. They do work in many other clusters, and maybe there's only one person in the organization who does GBV. All right, so moving on from the themes coming out of the qualitative research, as we discussed at the top of this presentation, what we're calling good and bad practices in functional areas. So for the presentation, we're saying good and bad, but really in the research itself, we talk about more impactful or least impactful for localization. All right, so the key functional area of participation. So overall, actors seeing that participation has improved for local actors. We see subclusters are comprised of nearly half local actors, yet meaningful participation can be lacking. Actors talked about contexts where participation is seen to be forced, as it is either a requirement to access pooled funding, or perhaps if you're an implementing partner, you have to participate in meetings. Actors talk about, are you filling a chair, but are you meaningfully contributing? Meaning, yes, you've perhaps sent a staff member to the meeting, but they are not contributing. So good practices, we see proactive engagement in all contexts, really removing barriers such as language and ensuring that local organizations know about meetings themselves. Another critical good practice was education. So not putting the onus on local organizations, but rather the subcluster itself, educating members around the humanitarian system, around the program cycle, and also benefits to benefits to participation beyond funding, right? What they can get through the subcluster and how this can benefit their organization. And lastly, many subclusters focused on capacity building, moving beyond these one-offs at, coaching, mentorship, case management. Some bad practices that were identified, participation as a checkbox, so participation being required, but this is just where you sign your name, not meaningful inclusion of local actors. Again, placing the burden of local actors to understand the system, so requiring that they really understand, for example, the H&O and HRP processes rather than allowing a space to educate and bring local actors along. Another bad practice was identified, for example, holding meetings only in English, or using meeting spaces which were not conductive. These could be spaces where, there's tension either between the government and local actors using a government space, or perhaps using a space which is too small for all actors to be able to participate. So leadership and decision-making, overall, decision-making for local actors is marked by the concepts which we discussed before as the blessed few, meaning that only a handful of local actors are really overwhelmed, meaning they're selected over and over to be leaders, to be IPs. Actors said this, they saw this as being pushed to provide services of lesser quality, and that this erodes movement building, putting all of the funding and the onus on a handful of local organizations rather than spreading this out among many. Some good practices that are identified as supporting consortias of CSOs, national NGOs, both in the humanitarian country team and the subclusters SAG. Another good practice was decentralization. So this means within contexts where there are sub-national GBV subclusters, allowing local actors to be the sector co-leads. Again, blessed few is a bad practice, really reserving decision-making only for local actors, which tend to be either the IP of UNFPA or other large INGOs. And another bad practice was not giving financial support for organizations, local organizations who take on subcluster co-leadership duties, but are not given funding for that coordination. So again, partnerships are a key driver for localization, yet overall all actors saw these as mainly exploitative and unequal. Local actors talked time and again about being included once a program was either designed or the funding had been granted, meaning they saw themselves as an IP only rather than being included from the program design process. Local actors talked about this placing them at risk for security risks, but then also causing unintended consequences. Some good practices in partnerships we see as capacity building initiatives, including individual organizational assessment and capacity building plans and IP agreements. The advocacy of the subcluster for improved partnership. We saw this across all contexts. And another good practice, for example, was a zero cash policy to avoid risks or perceptions of fraud. Bad practices including checkbox inclusion, meaning organizations as IPs only and not as equal partnerships. Partnerships which did not cover operating costs. A lack of duty of care. Again, local organizations saw that IP agreements push risks down and push security risks onto local actors. There are actually many really, really harrowing stories that came out from local actors talking about risk to their own lives and their teams' lives due to this. And overall, partnerships would push the risk down onto local partners. So again, engaging women-led organizations, unfortunately, there was really no meaningful engagement and no clear good practices that were identified as driving localization overall. Again, women-led organizations that are engaged are the blessed few. Rather, these are organizations that were incredibly strong, had good access and strong capacity before the emergency. They are not being included because they're WLOs, but because of their access and their strength. Some good practices that were identified included women-led organizations as members on the SAG, including women-led organizations in humanitarian leadership trainings, and providing global and national platforms for activists, female activists, and women-led organizations. But again, bad practices were mainly identified that women-led organizations are often excluded due to what we're putting in quotes as low capacity or language barriers, the identification that they don't have the right type of capacity to compete. The burden is placed on women-led organizations to participate. And again, the practice was identified that GBV funding is often allocated to large male and NGOs rather than women-led organizations. So looking at these last two functional areas against our four priority countries for partnerships, really the whole of Syria Turkey hub was the only context where partnerships were seen as equal. In Iraq, Nigeria, and South Sudan, partnerships were seen as IP only. Again, meaning, right, local actors are selected only as IPs to implement. As foot soldiers, they are not seen as equal partners. They are not included in program design. And in all contexts, women-led organizations were not meaningfully engaged. Engagement in the HNO and HRP process was mixed. In some contexts, local actors were totally excluded, meaning they had little access to funding, whereas in some contexts, improvement in funding is happening, yet still requirements present an undue burden. Some good practices include, well, maybe I'll first start with bad practices, and we can kind of, the flip of this is the good practice. So bad practice, many local organizations talked about being included in the HNO process only as data collectors, right? Their data was collected, and then their name was really stripped from that data, and that data was used by either an INGO or the UN actor as their own data. This means exclusion from analysis and workshops. And another bad practice which was identified was that HRPs, in some countries now consortia are required, but not enough time is allowed for real partnership, which leads to coercion, of course, for local actors being forced to join consortia with unequal power and footing. Whereas good practices were identified, which local actors are not just used for the data or mined their data, but really they're included both in data collection and the analysis, and are included throughout the process as really gatekeepers and owners of the data, not just collectors. I think a good example of this too is the GBV dedicated publication from the whole of Syria Turkey hub, the Syria Voices publication. Another good practice that was identified in South Sudan was open desk space. Many local organizations might not have desk space or access to Wi-Fi, so having this coaching and mentorship on the HNO and HRP process is really critical to bringing local organizations along. And lastly, pooled initiative funding. So country-based pooled funds are identified as the main source of funding for local actors, as they often have limited access to other direct funding streams. So this is unequal. In some contexts, this is improved, while in other contexts, this is not. Good practices include supporting consortium building so that local actors can pool together and access country-based pooled fund. As addressed earlier, opening desk space, partners ensuring that risk analysis and supporting financial systems is part of partnership agreements. And lastly, the subcluster advocating for improvement in the way that local actors can access pooled funding. Bad practices include inaccessibility or inflexible requirements, which place an undue burden on local actors. Another bad practice is that of bad intent. In some contexts, local actors were seen as committing fraud, where usually this was just because of financial systems and transparency. And lastly, indirect funding with no capacity building or mentorship. So again, looking at this, the functional processes of the HNO, HRP, and pooled funding in our four contexts, the HNO, meaningful inclusion of local actors, was only seen in South Sudan and Turkey. The HRP, really the blessed few were seen as having access, whereas only whole of Syria Turkey had meaningful inclusion for local actors. Pooled funding, both in Iraq and Nigeria, local actors said it was either the blessed few or very limited access. South Sudan, there is dedicated funding for local organizations, yet is limited. And again, the whole of Syria Turkey Hub was the only context where local actors saw direct access to funding, both pooled funding and outside funding. All right, so that really sums up all of our findings. I know I have talked for quite a long time. Just to briefly talk about recommendations. So of course, the summary report and the long form report give a much deeper dive into the recommendations because of course, again, we're coming out of this process. There are recommendations at many different levels and many recommendations have to be further looked at in terms of feasibility. So the global GBV AOR, there was discussion around establishing either a SAG or it might look different, but ensuring that local actors are included at the international level. The global GBV AOR ensuring that it's a platform for local actors, specifically through the call to action and advocacy at headquarters level. Other actions ensuring that localization is included in job descriptions for coordinators and for other actors. A capacity building strategy or humanitarian leadership strategy, ensuring that women-led organizations and that local actors in general are having their capacity built, and ensuring ground level communication, both in terms of what's happening at the global level is filtering down to the local level. So for country level GBV AOR, many of the recommendations were to continue a lot of the work that's already happening. So advocacy, which is happening in all contexts. A focus also on gender transformative work. So really asking subclusters to look at prevention and root causes, to support capacity building initiatives and looking at the humanitarian architecture. Ensuring that local actors are aware of the principles of partnership and how to advocate for themselves. And lastly, how country level GBV subclusters can support and empower women-led organizations and WLO networks. A key recommendation for UNFPA was to institutionalize the subcluster coordinator role and ensure that these subcluster coordinators are on long-term, well-funded, stable contracts. Really without that and without enough staff, localization is not going to be possible. Subcluster coordinators cannot wear 4 hats. Donors, of course, this is really, broad brush, but ensuring that grand bargain commitments are upheld, that really local actors are prioritized, that there's direct funding, that direct funding is there for operational support, building HR and financial systems, and that funding really requires capacity building. Again, this came out time and time again, that if localization is seen only as a checkbox and donor driven, then donors really need to be taking the responsibility to ensure that when they're providing funding, that they know how that funding is being spent and how localization is being carried out by the organizations they're funding. And lastly, for INGOs and UN organizations, really the focus is on ensuring that partnerships are equal and fair. So moving beyond IPs to having partnership agreements that are equal, where local organizations are provided with operational support, where capacity building is beyond these one-offs sitting in a hall for a few days, but rather is meaningful capacity building towards mentorship and secondment. And then also focusing on initiatives such as humanitarian leadership for women-led organizations and engaging grassroots localization efforts. All right, so that really concludes our findings. I'll hand it over, Debbie, to you to kind of field questions. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you so much, Carly. That was really helpful and incredibly informative, and it's great to have a chance to have you share these findings in greater depth. So we wanted to, I know there's a lot here and a lot discussed, so we wanted to open up the next few moments for a time of questions and discussions. It's a great resource to have Carly here, who is the one who spoke with all the participants directly and has really spent a lot of time with this data. So we wanted to open up the discussion now for questions. So you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly, and we have about 15 more minutes, so feel free, everyone, if you have questions or items you'd like to discuss. So are there any questions from the group? Otherwise, it sounds like if there are, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, we can give you a quick overview of how this kind of fits in with some of the other activities of the task team and to look out for. But we wanted to open it up. Feel free if anyone has any questions or comments on this research.
Yeah, hi, this is Andrew Wells-Dong. I'm with CARE in Washington, D.C., working with the advocacy team. And I'm involved now in a learning agenda on women and youth leadership in advocacy. And of your case studies, one is common with one of ours, which is South Sudan. We're also looking at West Africa and Latin America. I'd just be interested in, you mentioned that advocacy was happening in all the contexts, Carly. How are local women leading in advocacy? Did you find good examples of that or examples where it wasn't happening? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I mean, really, you know, advocacy really came out as happening really across all levels, right? Across all levels and by all actors. So, you know, for example, all subcluster coordinators were advocating with OCHA, with the HCT for inclusion of local actors, you know, and kind of improved fair partnerships and improved access to pooled funding. And kind of the next level down, we found that international actors were also advocating for local actor inclusion within their own organizations and within the subcluster. And lastly, local actors talked about advocating for themselves really at all levels, right? So advocating for the inclusion of local actors in terms of decision-making and access to funding within the subcluster. And then overall advocating just for women and girls in their communities, right? So we saw this, it's very different across contexts, but you know, an example being one local actor saying, you know, this is one geographic area where programming is not happening. And I go to the subcluster and I say, this is an area where women and girls really need services and I'm going to advocate for service provision there. So I think really advocacy is of course, it's happening across all levels, but this was again, it came up a few times in this presentation talking about humanitarian leadership. I think a lot of women, local actors talked about the benefit in having additional training and support around advocacy. I know the GBV AOR actually has an advocacy handbook. I believe that was put out 10 or 15 years ago by Beth Van, but I think really having more capacity building and support for local actors and advocacy would be greatly improved. I think one, I don't know if I'm directly answering your question, Andrew, but I think one kind of drawback or bad practice is that actors did talk about how oftentimes 16 days of activism can actually kind of draw the air out of the room, and that depending on what the focus is for 16 days of activism, which doesn't always align with whatever the challenges and priorities are in the country context, that this can actually sometimes be a challenge for local actors to advocate for what they see as most important.
Great, thanks. I look forward to looking at the report too.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
This is Claire speaking. I'm also a co-lead in the task team, and I just wanted to add an important point that came up from one of our subsequent workshops in Nairobi recently on advocacy, and it was just that a few of the women said that they have decided to try and be advocating on a lot of these issues in country, but what happens is that they feel that they get discriminated, particularly by INGOs and by donors, because they're seen as problematic. So, you know, they're not standing for some of these things around funding or partnership models, and by kind of standing up and saying that they know what the commitments are globally, they feel that there's discrimination happening there in the system against them. So they were saying that, you know, they would find it much more helpful if they could be supported on network building and alliance building, so that they could have a common voice and key messages, so that one or two key like women-led organizations don't have to necessarily take the hit in terms of the kind of the pushback that comes sometimes from being the first to stand up for some of these issues. And I thought that was a really interesting point that was raised.
Thank you so much, Claire and Andrew and Carly. Those are all really great points. And are there other questions or comments if you've had a chance to reflect on all the findings that Carly has shared?
Hi, it's Smruti here. Yes, Carly, thank you very much for that presentation. Really interesting and resonates very much with the workshops that we held in Nairobi and Bangkok. I had a question, just a further reflection on how they would like to really engage with global processes. There's a lot about the country level. But did you get a feel, or were there any comments about the global processes and how decision-making there impacts the local processes? Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. You know, what really came out of the comments on global processes, that often what happens is tokenism. That local actors very much feel like, okay, you know, we might be invited, you know, to a regional or a global workshop, you know, the first step, but then we're not invited back for the validation. You know, that where local actors felt very much, especially women-led organizations, that they were trotted out, you know, as a token in the beginning of a global process, but not meaningfully engaged. So I think, again, this really...
Did they say anything about the actual...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, did they say anything about the structures at global level and how they could be included in the global level decision-making structures?
For the GBV AOR?
Yes.
Yeah. So the GBV AOR, I know this is in greater discussions about how the GBV AOR itself is structured, and I know Debbie and Claire can speak to this more, but really there was many actors wish that the GBV AOR would have a structure similar to the Child Protection AOR, and having, you know, either a strategic advisory group or something that included local actors, so that local actors' voice was heard. And I know that the GBV AOR is kind of looking into that now. Maybe Debbie or Claire can speak more to that.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points. And I think maybe we can focus specifically on these conversations from the research, and then maybe at the end we can give a couple updates on sort of next steps with the project. But those are all really great points. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, this is Dorothy from Kenya. Thank you for the presentation, and I wanted to just confirm from the team that did the research. There exists competition among the national NGOs, and basically this hampers the localization efforts that even the INGOs are meant to really support them. From the research, were there any recommendations that the national NGOs were giving out to like support them not to, or to help them to diffuse that internal or even in country or even in context competitions that will offer an enabling environment to support localization efforts?
Thank you so much, Dorothy. Yeah, that it really came out loud and clear in all contexts that competition, you know, is quite difficult between not only national NGOs, but national NGOs and the government. You know, some good practices that were identified was just ensuring that when, you know, money is involved, that there be transparent and, you know, open communication. So for instance, organizations felt that, you know, again, the blessed few, right? That the same local organization was selected year after year after year by an INGO or by the UN to be the implementing partner. But that if that, that really kind of, there be a transparent and fair process for the selection of an IP. So that was seen to be, you know, as a bad practice and a place for growth. But really another good practice that was identified was supporting really, you know, movement building and supporting consortiums of national NGOs that did not include INGOs in the UN, but rather a space where national NGOs could receive funding and kind of support each other. But overall, there is no, you know, easy answer, right? Because competition, funding will remain to be limited in a lot of these contexts, and competition will, you know, unfortunately continue to occur. So it's really, it's still a complex problem.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions or comments from the group? If not, I thought it could be helpful just to let you know kind of how this piece of work fits in with some of the larger activities that the task team on localization is doing. As we mentioned, this was kind of the first initial project of the task team. And then what happened was, after the mapping study initial findings were gathered, we held a series of regional workshops over the past few months. One was in Jordan in June, and then there was in August a workshop in Asia in Thailand, and then there was a workshop in Africa in September. And essentially all of those 3 workshops focused on really unpacking some of the issues that were raised in this mapping study, but also thinking really specifically at the country level around action planning and potential recommendations in terms of how localization can be promoted. And so the reports, the Jordan workshop report has been circulated through the GBV AOR. So if anyone hasn't received it and you're interested, you can feel free to contact me and we're happy to share it. And then the reports from the other 2 workshops will be available soon. And then we will be releasing as well kind of a synthesis of some key takeaways across that. So you can keep an eye out for those documents. They should be available soon. And I wanted to flag that this piece of work was really sort of the start of what took place throughout the rest of the year with the task team. And the final report of the mapping study is currently being copy edited and some final design work. So it's very close to being done. And basically it'll include 3 documents. There's going to be a full report, which is the detailed version with all of the data and the findings. And then we're having a smaller summary report that's sort of a synthesis of the key points. And then there's an appendix of resources and guidelines. So it'll be sort of a packet of 3 documents that are all going to be released very soon. So you can keep an eye out for those as well. And so we're very happy again that we've had Carly with us. Carly has done a huge amount of work over many months on this process. And we know that Carly has also engaged with many of you on this call and many colleagues in the field across many countries. And so it was really a huge effort to carry out this research and to bring it together. And I think the fact that there is so many findings and there has been so much interest really reflects how important these issues are for work in the GBV community of practice and humanitarian context, and how it also connects with what's happening more broadly with the issue of localization and the work of the Global Protection Cluster. I know it was mentioned on this call, synergies with the child protection area of responsibility as well, and they have done a lot of work on this too. So Carly also looked a lot at what they had done. And so I think there's a lot of ways these fields can speak to one another. And there's unique issues, but there's also a lot of similarities. And thinking about where the synergies are is something that is really important and impactful. And so we really appreciate everyone's attendance today. And for those of you who will listen to this recording in the future, we thank you for that as well. And as I said, you can keep an eye out for the materials, the final versions of the mapping study report, as well as the reports that will be forthcoming around the regional workshops. And so I think we will leave it there for now, unless there are any questions. And does anyone have any last questions or comments that you would like to share before we wrap up? Otherwise, Carly, huge thanks to you, and thanks again for the excellent presentation. And thanks to all of you who have joined today. We really appreciate it, and you can feel free to be in touch with any questions. And I know these issues are something we can keep discussing for quite some time. So thanks, everyone, and we will talk to you all soon. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.